Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH, and today we're going to take a look at this thing right here, which is the Netgate 4100. Now that might not mean a whole lot to you, but let me make it a little bit more clear on what this is. Netgate is the company behind pfSense. And if you want pfSense, there are basically two options that you can have these days. You can have the open source version, which a lot of us have used for a long time, and we've definitely used it for years and years. But the other option is now that you can have pfSense Plus. Now pfSense Plus has different features, you can get support for it and all that kind of stuff. So if you want to run pfSense in a business, I think that a lot of folks are like, okay, that is really the plan going forward, is that you should be running pfSense Plus. And this unit, which is the Netgate 4100, is designed to run pfSense Plus. Today, the plan is we're going to take a look at this unit. We're going to talk about all the physical features. We're going to tear it apart. And then what I want to do is I really want to go and talk about, some of the performance and also some of the CPU stuff and accelerators and stuff like that that you don't generally hear. There's a lot of really weird information out there on this unit, as well as some of the stuff that goes into this. So I really want to go and deep dive into what's going on with the hardware. We'll also talk about things like performance, power consumption, and then I want to give you my thoughts and our key lessons learned. Now that sounds like a game plan. So let's get to it. Now on the front of the Netgate 4100, you basically have LED status lights, and there's a little thing that says Netgate, and that's about it. On the top of this unit, it's just a plain white top. There's really nothing to it, but at least things are going to get more exciting from here. On the side of this unit, what we're going to see is that we have some vents and, a Kensington lock port looks like, and all that kind of stuff, although that's not labeled. That looks like what it is. The other side, we have USB ports because why not? Now, the bottom of this unit, I think is actually even a little bit more exciting because what you see is just this giant metal. I mean, this is metal. The rest of this is plastic, but this is just some giant metal thing. You see the big fins that are on this. And what this is basically the heatsink for the entire unit. And on the bottom, you're also going to see this right here, which has the model number. It also has things like FCC and other types of regulatory markings. Now, the giant heatsink on the chassis and also the regulatory stuff might not seem like a big idea or a big deal, but when we look at some of the lower cost options that we've done reviews of that, if you're just like kind of go buy something on AliExpress or Amazon or something like that and then try putting pfSense on it, there are passively cooled units, but this is definitely a different tier of design. There are a lot of businesses where you just can't put things that don't have the regulatory markings as an example, and also this feels like a very solid piece and very nice heatsink, and it works fine in all of our testing. We haven't really seen any issues with it, so this is, I think, plenty in terms of cooling for a relatively low TDP processor. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of the other units versus this unit when we get to our key lessons learned, but what I'd like to do is get to the rear of the unit, which really has, I guess, the money shot for the system. Now at the far side over here, what you'll see is that there's a console port, and there's a USB and RJ45 one, and with the system, you actually get a little console cable, so you can use this nice USB cable and have a serial console into the unit. You don't see things like a display output. So if you want to have a system that you can just go plug into a monitor, a TV, or something like that and get the display output, that's not what this system has, because this is really designed more as like an embedded box, so you don't have an iGPU in the Atom processor that's in this. We're gonna talk a little bit more about that processor in a bit. The next feature though is really the network ports, and that's really kind of what everybody wants to see anyway. So the first thing that you're gonna see on the side of this is that we get two combo ports. Now these are 1 gigabit per second ports, and you have the option to either run the RJ45 in each of them, or you can go and put an optic in there and go run 1 gigabit on the fiber side. But you do have to pick between the two of them because, well, they're combo ports, so you have to pick one or the other, but you get at least two of those. So there is some flexibility there. The other side though is that these are 1 gigabit per second ports. These are not 2.5 gig per second ports, and they're also labeled as the WAN ports. You'll see that these are actually labeled as WAN 1 and WAN 2, and when you get into pfSense Plus, that is how they are actually shown as default in the system. Now, if you do, and you can totally go do this, but if you do decide that you want to go and reconfigure these interfaces to something that's different, you can use them as a LAN or something else. If you want to go do that, you're going to have a mismatch between what you see in the UI and what's labeled on the chassis. Now, it's very common in pretty much all of the commercial systems, but at the same time, it's just, you're probably going to have to go through some tape or something and actually go and relabel that, or you don't have to, and then they'll just mismatch, but you're probably going to want to take care of that. This at least gives you the guide for getting started and really having that initial setup experience. So I really like what pfSense and the Netgate folks have done with pfSense Plus here. Now, the next one is actually quite interesting, and that's these ports right here. Now, these ports are actually 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports. And you might say, well, Patrick, why do we care about these 2.5 gig Ethernet ports? Well, first off, there are 4 of them because we have an Intel Atom C3000 series processor, and so we're able to have 4 of these ports on board. The other kind of cool thing about them, though, is that these are not switched ports. So on some of the other Netgate appliances, these were switched ports, and there are benefits and disadvantages to both. For example, if you have switched ports, if you put like all these on a little switch chip, one thing that you can do is actually get pretty decent performance between all of them because you don't have to go hit a CPU. But on the flip side, if you want to use them as just kind of standard interfaces where you have basically the network port that goes into a NIC and then goes through the CPU and all that kind of stuff into pfSense, then if you have that kind of, or you want that kind of chain, which is kind of the standard chain, then having the 4 independent ports like this is actually a better option. So it depends a little bit on what kind of usage model you have, and I kind of think that this one I kind of like, and I do prefer just generally this model over the switched one, although I know that folks have opinions on all this stuff, and feel free to leave those in the comments if you'd like. And 2.5 gig Ethernet, that's really become a lot more common this year. So it is something that we have been putting a lot of focus on in terms of talking about different switches, especially at the lower end of the market where you'd have something like this and you probably have a low end switch. So we've done a number of 2.5 gig Ethernet switches. We've also done other firewall devices that are kind of like build your own or little PCs and stuff like that with 2.5 gig Ethernet. We've seen it in big workstations, and so we're really kind of focusing on how do we get that 2.5 gig Ethernet to more users, and this is definitely a way to do that, especially if you want your router and firewall appliance to have 2.5 gig Ethernet. Now, next to that, what you're going to see is that we have right here a nice little tiny power input. It's just a standard DC power input, but it has a little feature that's a lot of fun. This little 12 volt DC input actually has, you'll see this little ring around it, and what that's for is that you can use something like this, which is a DC input, but you can actually screw it on there. And here's why. And this is basically, I'm going to show you guys exactly why you want to do this. You can actually go, and if you had to, you can go and have your power supply hanging from this whole thing. And even if it's hanging because it's locked in place, this unit will stay powered up. And that's really the idea behind the locking one. A lot of DC barrel jacks are great because they're pretty easy to go find and all that kind of stuff. But on the flip side, the challenge with a DC power input like this is that, somebody goes and, somebody's rummaging around next to cables, they pull out the power supply and all the firewall, dies and, is turned off and stuff like that because it's no longer has power. So having a locking connector, I really like that, and that is actually a feature of the power supply that comes with this unit. Now, the power supply itself actually matches the Netgate 4100 because they have a white power supply. It's a small touch, but it's also kind of nice. It's also a 60 watt power supply, which is way too much for the system. We're going to talk about that in our power consumption, but it frankly is not going to use anywhere near 60 watts. One of the other kind of fun little things is that this actually does have some regulatory markings on it, which we have not seen in some of the really low cost systems that we've looked at. So it is just another little differentiator that we have it both on. We have some markings both on the Netgate 4100, the chassis itself, as well as the power supply. But let's talk really briefly about what are those specs inside that system, because you can't really see inside the system too easily. So what we're going to do is peel away some of the plastics. You can actually see what's on the other side. One side is basically that giant heatsink, but the other side you can actually go put some things in. And one example of that is that you can actually put extra, an NVMe SSD, and there is an option. So we have the Netgate 4100, which is $599 currently. There is a 4100 Max, which is a little bit more. I think it's like $699, so it's about $100 more, and that adds a 128 gigabyte NVMe SSD. Our unit has a 16 gigabyte eMMC flash storage built in. It also has 4 gigabytes of memory, although it's not ECC memory. And then we also have an onboard processor, which is the Intel Atom C3338R. Now, let's talk about that Intel Atom C3338R for a second here. Now, let's talk about what it is and what it's not. Now, is this the fastest processor in the world? Absolutely not. Now, the chip itself actually has 2 cores, and these are kind of the lower power Atom cores. So these are now what Intel would call an E core or something like that. And you get 2 cores, so it is a multi, core design, which is good. You also in Denverton have out of order and all that kind of stuff. So I mean, it's a big difference between the modern Atom and then the Atom that I think a lot of people think about from the way old days where you had like an in-order instruction set and all that kind of stuff. This is totally, totally different. And these are actually pretty nice things that are used everywhere. I mean, we see these things not just in like VPN and firewall boxes, but we also see the Atom C3000 series in like high-end, like 100 gigabit or 25 gigabit Ethernet switches. I mean, there's definitely a broad range of devices that these Atom processors go in, and this is exactly the type of application it's designed for. Now, that refresh means a couple things. First off, I think the original 3338 was a 1.5 or C3338 was a 1.5 gigahertz chip. This is actually a 1.8 gigahertz chip as part of the refresh. We also got a little bit more TDP, but the other feature that is completely, that makes the R more than the 300 megahertz extra is actually the fact that this has Intel QuickAssist technology, or QAT, on that chip. And if you're wondering, can you go upgrade a C3000 processor? You cannot. They are soldered onto the motherboards. So whatever you get in the system, like the Netgate 4100, is what you're going to have. You are not going to be able to upgrade it. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about performance when we kind of get to that part. But what I think is worthwhile doing now is let's go look at some of the software side. So when you log into pfSense Plus, frankly, if you use pfSense, you're going to be immediately at home, and that's just what it is. If you've never used pfSense before, you're probably going to have at least some time learning what this is. Now, I know a lot of folks are on the fence about this whole pfSense Plus thing because, frankly, there are some differences. Netgate has to go and drive revenue for their business. I get that, and so they are making it so there are certain features that are on the pfSense Plus, but they're not necessarily on the regular pfSense. And a really good example of that is actually that QAT technology that we just previously talked about. Now, I know we're going to get a lot of comments because there are folks in the community that don't like the fact that they are doing this, and it does mean that there is going to be more effort being put into pfSense Plus than in the standard pfSense. Is going to be kind of, more features in the Plus version. And so I understand that, there are definitely both sides of that, but I'll give you a good example of where it matters is that this unit uses, 2.5 gig Ethernet, and it uses the Atom C3000 series. But if you did have a just kind of standard NIC, like an Intel i225 NIC, and you wanted to go put that into a just pfSense kind of normal, the Netgate folks actually worked on, they basically took, I think it was kind of like an unfinished driver from Intel, worked on it, actually got it running with FreeBSD, and now that has become the like FreeBSD driver for the i225. So, the fact of the matter is that we do get some things in pfSense that are really funded by the pfSense Plus and the sale of these appliances. And so we just kind of have to, let's kind of get that out of the way and just kind of talk about what it is. Now, something else you're going to notice is the fact that I did manage to delete accidentally the wonderful screen captures that we had before. So we're just kind of going to walk through some of the things that you're going to see in the web interface. Of course, you have all of your normal kind of router firewall. You can do your VPN things. You can do all those kind of things that you might want to go do on a normal pfSense box, and you have the ability to do that with pfSense Plus. And the other important thing is, again, you can get subscriptions to pfSense Plus, and if you need support or something, well, that might be what you want to have for your business. And frankly, compared to like some of the other firewall and VPN vendors, these things can be less expensive by a pretty considerable margin, especially when you start using things like those VPN features. But VPN features, performance, let's get to that real quick. So I mentioned earlier that this unit uses the Intel Atom C3338R. And if I say R enough, I'm going to sound like a pirate or something like that. I don't know, but just bear with me. R means refresh in this context. And what we got was we did get more performance. It was actually like a 15 to 20% performance boost just by having higher clock speeds in that generation. But the bigger one, of course, is QAT, or Intel QuickAssist technology. QAT, what it basically does in terms of when we talk about all those gigabits and all that kind of stuff, is that the idea is that there are workloads where you have to do crypto and compression. Those are the two big ones. And I'll give you a couple examples. Like if you have something like a VPN and you want to go have an IPsec VPN, offloading the encryption to the QAT accelerator means that you are not having to use the CPU cores to do a lot of that work. And this is not really relevant to the Netgate 4100, but another really good example of where that is used is actually in things like storage devices. Because what you can do is offload compression, and there are compression accelerators on the QAT device. And what that allows you to do is get a lot of performance on compression without having to hit those CPU cores again. So once that kind of software became mainstream, then you started to see that QAT would get integrated into things like pfSense, and that's why we have it in pfSense Plus here. Now that was pretty long on QAT, but it's super important when we go look at the performance of this unit. And we are going to have a piece very, very soon. It's probably going to be one of the next 1, 2, 3 videos on STH where we actually go and look at like all the way up to like the 100 gig version. But to me, that is the key feature of the Intel Atom C3338R and what makes that refresh very exciting. Now, when we look at performance, a lot of folks ask about the performance of this. And you know, if you look at the Netgate site, we're just going to show you this real quick. You're going to see that they say, you know, you can do like over 8 gigabits per second in terms of like iPerf 3, LL3. I mean, sure, you can totally go do that, but let's call it how it is. This is basically the use case for this thing. People aren't going to buy this box and go run like 8 gigabits per second through it. The vast majority of folks, how they're basically going to use it is they're going to have a 1 or 2 WAN ports or WAN connectivity options. They're going to use those, and those are maximum 1 gigabit per second. And then they're going to flow through traffic to the LAN ports. So how I look at this device is this is really like a 1 gigabit per second class firewall and VPN appliance. It's not really something that's designed to be like a 10 gigabit appliance, and that's just how it is. Now, if you're not gonna run like a whole bunch of really crazy firewall rules or something like that, you can actually go and, you know, use one of these as a WAN port, use another one as a LAN port, and you can just kind of pass traffic through, and you actually will be able to do that at pretty close to the 2.5 gig Ethernet speeds. We were getting basically on iPerf 3, we were getting pretty darn close to the wire speed, so we're just gonna call that what it is. In terms of a firewall, if you have a firewall set up on this, you can definitely saturate a 1 gig link. And so if you're just using this as kind of your just kind of basic firewall device, no problem there. You're going to be able to go and saturate the link on a 1 gig port. But we're going to talk about 2 VPN types because those are really what I think folks want to always hear about. The first one we're going to talk about is OpenVPN. Now, on the OpenVPN side, the interesting thing here is that OpenVPN does not get really offloaded to Intel QAT. And what that means is that you're not going to go see a lot of the offload. And so you're basically stuck using the cores. And by getting stuck using the cores, it means that you're really limited to these 2 1.8 gigahertz cores that are those Atom cores. And it just frankly, you don't have enough performance. OpenVPN is not a high performance VPN. It's an easy to set up VPN. And those are 2 totally different things. Realistically, you will get somewhere in the 200 to maybe 225 megabits per second if you're just kind of running like iPerf 3 traffic. But when you run real traffic through that, you're going to see a pretty massive drop in terms of overall performance. So firewall OpenVPN wise, this is 200 megabits per second kind of max, but then depending on what your actual traffic mix is, it's going to go down by a pretty significant margin from there. To me though, the big one is definitely IPsec, because the reason that you get a device like this is really maybe you have an IPsec VPN infrastructure, you want to kind of add more to it, and this unit can actually use the Intel QAT and offload to all the IPsec encryption to the QAT accelerator, and so you're not hitting those CPU cores as much, and that gives you a lot more performance. So where you see the maximum throughput that you're going to get like with iPerf 3 on like an OpenVPN in that like a little over 200 megabits per second range. But when we get to IPsec, you're going to see that you get 900 megabits, a little over 900 megabits per second on this unit rather than getting something that's way lower than that. Just the overall performance of IPsec. Normally IPsec is pretty rough, but in this device, because you have QAT, you can actually get pretty darn good performance with it. Now, power consumption has gotten a lot more expensive, especially if you're in places like Europe. So a lot of people really care about the power consumption and how much these little devices that are on 24/7 actually use. And so I figured, well, let's just kind of show you. Okay, so plugging this unit in, you're going to see that the max that we actually had in terms of a peak while we were turning this thing on was I think about 12.4 watts. But during the boot process, you're gonna see that it sits somewhere in the 10 to 11 watt range. And so now what we're gonna do is, let's just go plug in one of these to like one of the 1 gig WAN ports, and we're using a super long run here to just test this. And what you're gonna see is that we added maybe about 0.4 to 0.5 watts. Okay, and now that we have this thing all booted, let's go and we're just under 11 watts here, but let's go take a little WAN cable and let's go plug that into one of the WAN ports. And this is a 1 gigabit connection, so this is not one of the 2.5 gig connectors. We can see that that is usually somewhere in the about half a watt to about 0.6 watts. You also see that if we light up the 2.5 gig, we're gonna get a little bit more. Wow, this thing is swinging like crazy. But when we light up the 2.5 gig, like we lit up 2.5 gig right here, and you can see that those use probably a little bit closer to about 0.8 to about 1 watts per. And so they definitely use a little bit more. Now, of course, this is also gonna vary a little bit on cable lengths, but the way to kind of think of it is that maybe somewhere between maybe a half a watt and 1 watt per port that you have active. Of course, optics are gonna be a little different as well. And just in terms of maximum power consumption, we never logged this thing going anywhere over 20 watts in all of our testing. Maybe you can get some optics or something like that and maybe get it there, but the Atom processor just doesn't use that much power, and the NICs in here are just not that high enough power NICs. And so it's just something that, you know, this uses way less than the average just PCIe network card that we're putting into our servers these days. This entire firewall uses less power than that. And I know somebody's gonna ask, this is a silent system, there are no fans, and I definitely did not hear any coil whine, so I would call this a silent system. So just kind of for noise, 0. But what I love doing is always talking about our key lessons learned. I mean, what did we learn with this device? Like, what here is the exciting bit? To me, the first thing is pricing. This thing is $599. Now, if you're going to go look at some of the other units that we review, I think that, you know, people are going to say that that's super expensive. This on top is one of the ones that you can see we have on our YouTube channel. This is actually an Intel N50105 based system. You have 4 2.5 gig Ethernet. So you have fewer ports. You don't have optical ports or anything like that, but it's also way less expensive. So to me, there are a couple things that are differentiating, and you know, people will just say, oh, it's a couple $100 less for it, and it is, but there are definitely some big points of differentiation that we should talk about. First off, the processor in this, if you're not using QuickAssist, the processor in the cheap box is actually much, much faster. And we're not using ECC memory in the Netgate box, so on that front, it's not like you can say, oh, this one has ECC, this one doesn't, so that's not really a differentiator. So I do think from a performance perspective, if you just you know, if you have a lab environment and you need more CPU power for whatever you're doing, this is still the Netgate 4100 is still a 2-core Atom design, and there's no way to get around that if that's what you're looking for CPU performance. You know, you're kind of stuck with that. You're also stuck with 4 gigabytes of memory that's soldered onto the motherboard, so you don't have, you know, the ability to go put like 16 or 32 gigs in it. You're stuck with 4. And so I think from a flexibility and just CPU performance perspective, and the fact that you have a GPU, so it makes it easy just to kind of hook up to a TV and start working on, you know, I do think that there are benefits to the less expensive units. That being said, though, there is a huge and a just chasm in terms of quality here. We did a little preview piece of this, and there somebody actually saw who makes this box. This is not made by some kind of random small, you know, super cost sensitive vendor or something like that. So this is definitely done to a different set of quality standards than you would see with the less expensive boxes that we review. The other side to it, though, is that this came with pfSense Plus, which gives us additional features and the ability to go and have that support, and it's already pre-installed, so you don't have to go do anything. And frankly, I get a little bit nervous on, you know, if something like this comes with pfSense installed because it's getting installed at some random factory somewhere that, you know, you just don't know about. So if your time is valuable, this is faster. It also uses less power, by the way, than the little AliExpress units. The big thing, though, is that quality-wise, this is definitely in a completely different league. But that also means that we have to think about not just how this fits in, you know, the overall and all the little cheap things that you can get on AliExpress. It also means that we should be thinking about where does this fall in Netgate's overall line. This is Netgate's entry-level Intel-based solution. And so if you go below this, you're probably going to have an ARM solution. And if you go above this, you're definitely going to be on an x86 solution. This is the 4100. So you get 4 gigabytes of memory, you get 16 gigabytes of eMMC, but you're at $599. For like $200 more, you can get the $799 6100. And that 6100, if you're concerned about CPU performance, frankly, that is way, way better because that has the Intel Atom C3338, which is 4 cores instead of 2. It's also a higher clock speed because you get 2.2 gigahertz on those cores. And so between the higher clock speed and more cores, you get more CPU performance. You also get more memory because that has been doubled from 4 gigabytes to 8 gigabytes. The other thing you get with that is you actually get 10 gigabit per second SFP plus ports. So you're not just limited to 1 gig, you also get 10 gig. And that's also just because of the different IO that you get on the chips. And if you look at the performance impact of that, if you're just looking at Netgate's numbers, because we don't have the 6100, you're going to see that you get like 2x, roughly 2x the performance for about $200 more. So if you really care about performance and you're like, this has a 2-core, this 4100 only has a 2-core Atom and it's just not enough for me. The answer is, frankly, you just need a higher end box. And it's one of those deals where you're talking about maybe 33% more dollars, but you're getting like 2x the performance. So, that's an easy one to take advantage of, right? Cool. So I hope you like this look at the Netgate 4100. There's a lot of really kind of cool features and a lot of really nice things that the company did. I do think that, a lot of folks are going to comment on pricing, and that is what it is these days. But if you do want to learn more about QuickAssist technology, you definitely should be subscribing to the STH YouTube channel and checking out the main site. We already have a piece looking at QAT accelerators. Hopefully that's live before this video. But we're also going to have a huge thing that we did with Intel, actually looking at the QAT acceleration or QuickAssist technology acceleration that is going to, I think, blow people's minds and really show folks what the technology is used for, talk about who's using it, and all those kind of things that, I think a lot of folks just have questions about QAT. We're going to answer that there. So if you did like this video, well, why don't you give it a like, click subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. As always, thanks for watching and have an awesome day.